Hello and welcome back to Interconnected. This is Season 2. This is the podcast that explores the intricate links between life's most profound, weird and wonderful things. I'm Jake Robinson.
And I'm Robin Taylor.
And in each episode we discuss an interesting science topic and challenge ourselves to connect it with another subject that might seem completely unrelated, sometimes trivial or even quirky.
Yeah, I mean, try minestrone soup and megafauna, or ninjas and nuclear reactors.
Interesting. We hope you find the podcast thought-provoking and entertaining and invite you to explore the interconnectedness of life.
So without further ado, let's get right into the show.
Let's do it. So first off now, we've swapped out news, what was it called? Neck of the Woods. So to start with, we swapped out the Neck of the Woods for a new little snippet of the show, and it's called Good News. Because we're hammered with lots of bad news all the time, so we thought we'd give you 1 minute each of a good news story. Have you got any good news stories, Robin?
Well, you know, it's funny you should say that, but I'm not going to remark about a specific good news story.
Okay.
But I did want to kind of come into that theme, which is that you're right, that right now we do seem to be in a doom and gloom cycle. So loss of biodiversity, climate change, catastrophes, bipartisanship, political unrest, Middle East blowing up, blah, 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 blah. But I have a completely different take on it. I actually am really excited. So my good news for me is I actually feel this is a time of fundamental opportunities. And whilst things are definitely fraught and dangerous, and there's real potential for some really sad stories to come out, but I think if I was to be a little bit more of a cynical person, prior to all these tragedies that are now right on our face, for me, it felt like things were definitely going downhill because it's almost like a slow creep or a slow death. But now things are being shaken up and it feels like, there's a real opportunity for things to change. And I guess for me, one of the things that I feel really heartened about and positive about is just seeing how, let's say, particularly in the climate action space, and because I'm in education particularly, just seeing how the youth of today, not just in our school, but also around Fiji and also around the globe, just seem to be engaging a lot more, I feel, with what the political issues are of the day. Versus when I was a student, I don't think I was as nearly connected. And I know my friends weren't either. So for that, it feels really good. It feels really great. And I'm excited to be alive at this moment, despite the fact it feels like we're walking along the edge of a precipice or a cliff. But that's kind of exhilarating. I mean, some people actually pay for that.
Sure, nice. I'm going to give you a news story that's slightly less profound, but it carries on the theme of students. I've just clicked on goodnewsnetwork.org, and there's an interesting study out that shows that 1 minute phone breaks can help keep college students more focused in the classroom. What do you think about that, Robin?
I don't know. Tell me
you're a teacher.
More. Yeah.
Well, researchers investigated whether letting students use their phones for very brief amounts of time can enhance classroom performance, and it seems to have worked. The long-term experiment showed that allowing 1 minute mobile phone breaks in college classrooms could result in more focus, less mobile use during lectures, and higher test scores. There you go. Maybe we've got to get with the times. Let the students have a little bit of time on their phone.
But that's just a simple stimulus response, just a reward cycle, isn't it? I'm rewarding you with this amount of time. I mean,
True.
Maybe in previous years it was allow 1 minute a Game Boy, or in previous years. So, yeah, I'm not sure it's the phone itself. But yeah, I'll tell you what I do think is really weird about this is just the idea that psychologists have consistently shown there aren't many things that are universal, but one of them is that the average person has an attention span of about 15 to 20 minutes. So why do university lecturers go on for an hour?
Yeah, exactly.
That makes no sense. So
yeah.
I think having that 1 minute break every so often, I mean, if you have a break, your interest can come back. It won't be quite as long, but it'll be a little bit better. But you should probably aim for within an hour schedule to have at least one, if not two breaks.
I agree completely. My attention span is... Sorry, what were we talking about? Right, let's move on. Okay, so today's topic is all about bats again. So we covered bats in the last series a little bit, how cool bats are, but how they get bad press for a lot of things.
Right.
And in this episode, we're going to talk about a bat disease called white nose syndrome, which is...
In fact, we mentioned that in the last...
Did we mention white nose syndrome?
We actually mentioned it, yeah. Because we were talking about how we thought it was spelunkers that were cavers. Yeah, exactly. Who go caving.
Yeah,
so could be responsible for that.
Hopefully I'm not duplicating things, but it's a completely different link anyway, at least. So this white nose syndrome is known as P. destructans, and it basically affects the bats as they're hibernating. So it wakes them up during hibernation and then kills them because they have to use so much energy to wake up during hibernation. Then they don't have enough energy left to hibernate again once they try and go back to sleep, and they simply don't wake up. up. But anyway, this fungus is from Europe and it was brought over to America. And they think it was brought over probably by cavers, or at least spread around the country by cavers.
Right.
So these bats, they live in deep, dark caves across America. And in something like 2006, there was a massive outbreak of this white nose syndrome. They found tens of thousands of bats just lying dead on the floor. They didn't wake up from hibernation. And they found this white fluffy stuff on their nose and then sequenced it and found it was this fungus. They're still not 100% sure where it's from, but they believe it's from Europe and Asia.
Yes, I remember the last time we had the discussion, it was like a throwaway thing right at the end of our podcast.
Got you, yes.
You were trying to explain a little bit about, what happens and where it happens. And I think we were left off with basically, could it be that you'd have to have spelunkers or cavers would actually have to, completely sterilize their equipment going into caves. And that just seemed like a very weird thing that you have people that are going into, by definition, wilder places that is probably not as clean and sterile. And yet to go in and to go out of them, you have to be completely sterile and stuff like that. Yeah. And I guess, what we hadn't done is we hadn't figured out, that wasn't the point of our podcast, but we were talking about, just how the bad image or the bad press of bats was really bad. But I think we'd spoken about the fact that bats do seem to be very much in the news at the moment, sadly, because of, again, bad press associated with COVID pandemic and as vectors for diseases. But we're also suggesting that bats are potential reservoirs of solutions against viruses, because the reason why they're able to survive is because they carry such a high viral load, which means that they have got effective defenses against it. And we don't have that. So if we're to look for it, we do actually need to look towards bat populations, which is ironic given that is in fact why the Wuhan lab was set up there, because it's close to bat colonies. And therefore that all gets interconnected into the political realm, doesn't it? Because suddenly it becomes geopolitics. And it's not necessarily about the biology and the epidemiology of an epidemic, which then transformed into a pandemic.
Yeah, true.
So that's, I think, where we left it.
Yeah, I think it was. And we also mentioned this kind of One Health perspective where, you need to restore and protect the bats' habitats in order to keep them healthy, because if you degrade the habitats, they become stressed, and then stress equals a higher likelihood of viral shedding. So essentially, we need to protect the habitats for ourselves and for the bats. But healthy bats means less disease and spillovers.
Didn't we suggest that one of the solutions might be to start putting heaters in their caves for the ones that are affected?
I think you suggested that, yeah.
I think I did suggest that.
Funnily enough, there have been some quite innovative solutions along similar lines. So they're spraying probiotic bacteria in the caves to try and boost the bats' microbiome to give them a bit more immunity. And I think they are using things like UV lights, etc., to try and kill the fungus as well. So yeah, not too far off.
But wouldn't that also destroy the microbiome that could actually be beneficial?
The UV lights.
If you're just doing a broad spectrum antibiotic, it kills all your gut bacteria, and therefore you're not
potentially. Maybe they're looking at both of them together, so giving them probiotics whilst trying to just target the fungus somehow.
And so, Jake, it turned out that we were ahead of the game. Our podcast was ahead of something that actually made international news, I believe.
Yeah, so it was a study out in, I think it was Science a few weeks ago, that essentially showed that this white nose syndrome disease, this fungus called P. destructans, so it started in New York State in 2006, and then ever since it's been spreading around the East Coast and towards the Midwest, and then it made this giant leap over to Washington State sometime in the mid-10s, so something like 2015-ish.
I think that's when Steve went caving. He was Steve from New York.
Yes, I think Steve. It
was either Steve or Alan.
Yes, actually, funnily enough, the reason it was discovered in the first place was because of two cavers who were doing their thing. They were caving and they took a photo of some bats as they noticed some weird white stuff on their nose.
Okay.
They took a photo of it and then they stored it away, thinking not much of it. They were like, unusual, but didn't really think anything of it. And then a couple of years later, this massive decline in bats where tens of thousands of bats were just found lying on the floor. Yeah, it hit the news. And then I think this must have triggered the cavers' memory. They were like, oh, wow, yeah, we did notice some white stuff. And then they handed the photo into the authorities, and that was the first ever finding of this white nose syndrome, so 2006. And since then, it's decimated bat populations across America. So there's some estimates that over 10 million bats have died, maybe even more.
And what does that mean as a percentage? Any idea? I mean, I know 10 million sounds a lot.
It is a lot, yeah. So in some bat communities, it's something like 95%.
Wow.
Just completely wiped out the whole population.
I think you did say that, yeah.
Huge numbers, yeah. So incredibly concerning for bat conservationists. Again, they are working on lots of innovative strategies. There's some signs in some populations that they're evolving resistance, which is good.
Given, the bad press that, the bats have got, I mean, you and I and other bat lovers would be different, but wouldn't the vast majority of humanity say, well, good riddance?
Possibly so. This is what this podcast is for. We need to inform them that that's a bad idea. Yes. So this paper in Science, it actually made a link between the introduction of white nose syndrome in America, leading to a sharp decline in bat populations.
Right.
So most of these microbats, they feed on insects. They're called insectivorous species.
Right.
So
these aren't the fruit bats.
Exactly. We've spoken about fruit bats before.
Yeah.
They obviously feed on pollen and fruit and nectar, etc. And they're much larger, like flying bears. These microbats, these feed on insects, up to something like 3,000 insects each per night. So Yikes. They're great at mosquito control, for instance. So they keep mosquitoes at bay. They also feed on 3,000 agricultural pests each per night if they're around these large croplands. And this is really important for farmers. So these little microbats play an important ecosystem service role by mopping up all these little pests that would chew away at their crops.
So these are natural pesticides.
Natural pesticides, yeah. Little fluffy flying pesticides, mopping up all the little insects that would wreak havoc on the agricultural crops. That's only one reason they're really important. There's lots of other ecosystem roles they play, such as pollination and seed dispersal, etc. But yeah, this agricultural role, it probably saves the economy billions of pounds every year, just the bats themselves. And because the bat population plummeted due to this white nose syndrome fungus that humans brought over to North America, I just emphasize that because it just, we've got to take some responsibility for these things. So the bat population declined massively, and therefore the agricultural pests increased because that natural pesticide was no longer around.
Right. So the solution is then, so after the pests are now decimating agricultural crops.
Yes.
And so, of course, the solution for the farmers will be what?
Yeah, the natural human way of thinking would be to turn to something artificial, particularly in this modern world, or something synthetic. We need a quick fix for it. And this quick fix would be a chemical pesticide. So the farmers were essentially turning to chemical pesticides that aren't very good for the environment, and they often kill lots of insects that they're not supposed to kill, which themselves play really important ecosystem service roles like pollination, etc., important roles in the food chain. So they turned to these synthetic chemicals and they started spraying these across all the crops because the bats were no longer around to play this important pesticide role.
So just to recap, so the bats are dying off.
Yes.
They are the natural predators for things that would otherwise be munching away in agricultural crops.
Exactly.
The farmers realize that they are not getting the same yields as before. They're not sure why that happens. So what they do is they start pouring on additional synthetic pesticides, which tends to destroy the ecosystem. But that's just situation normal, isn't it? I mean, why is that bad?
So as I mentioned, the pesticides aren't very good for the environment. It's obviously decimating a lot of the insects. And if you might have heard of this concept called insectageddon, it's basically we've seen this worldwide massive decline in insects. I wouldn't say invariably across nations, but in many nations we're seeing this massive decline in insect populations, and it's led to this term insectageddon.
Just that small interjection there, but did we talk about the idea of, that people had been noticing less bugs on windscreens?
Exactly.
But the point is that scientists have figured out they think they can see a decline in the insect population because people have noticed.
Due to a lack of insects on the windscreens nowadays.
Due to a lack of insect smear on windscreens.
Exactly,
So, you shouldn't laugh. That's disrespectful to the insects.
I know. Well, me. If you don't laugh, you cry. Where were we at? So what I'm trying to ask though is that isn't the world using insecticides anyway? So what's the deal? Yeah, the world's using more of it anyway. But obviously we're destroying biodiversity, and you mentioned at the start of the show we're living in a biodiversity crisis. Right. A lot of these synthetic approaches, these quick fixes, these are some of the drivers of biodiversity decline, as well as this monoculture kind of crop plantation, which is destroying the soil. 75% of the soils across the planet are currently degraded. 60% of all species in the world live in soils. And so we need to really stop damaging the soils and the ecosystems.
So are you basically saying
one of the main
that
reasons?
I think if I've understood you correctly, you're saying basically a fungus that we've introduced to a bat population has basically caused us to further degrade the system because we're in fact putting more insecticides and pesticides.
Well, exactly.
onto our crops.
So it's a double whammy for the biodiversity crisis. So we've introduced this fungus. It's wiping out lots of different bat species. It's not just one particular species of bat. So if you think about it from a biodiversity perspective, that direct effect is already reducing biodiversity in the world, contributing to this crisis. But then the bats play an important role in managing agricultural pests. If they die, then farmers turn to these synthetic chemicals. We spray them across the fields, and then we're reducing biodiversity even more by destroying lots of different insects, probably having a detrimental effect on the soil microbiome as well. So this is just this perfect storm we're creating by thinking that we're solving one issue, but we're actually exacerbating the biodiversity crisis itself.
Small interjection here. I thought the issue is that the report they were citing in Science was that they're showing a case between that and childhood diseases.
Well, yes, I haven't got to that point yet.
Okay, sorry. I thought you'd missed out. I'm kind of going, what is he havering on about? I'm trying to give you all these leads, and you're just like going on and on and on.
I haven't got there yet, man. I thought you were just interested in what the detrimental effects of pesticides on biodiversity. I thought you were just interested in that point. Why pesticides are bad for biodiversity. I didn't realise you wanted me to get straight to the point. Hurry up, Jake. Okay.
No, I thought you were just missing it.
But seeing as you've ruined it now, because you've told everybody the plot line. Yes, we'll jump straight to that then. So essentially, I won't talk about biodiversity loss anymore because who cares about that? But let's get straight to the point.
Okay. I think that's super interesting, the double whammy that you spoke about, because that's something that we don't often recognize, that it's this exacerbated, escalating issue that's coming up. And that's just bad news all around, isn't it? I mean, you've got the double whammy where the first time it actually reduces the bat population, then it destroys the sort of ecosystem or the balance within the ecosystem, and then humans decide they're going to take things into their own hands, and because they're recognizing that, and then they're destroying the ecosystem even more. So
exactly,
lack of bats destroys the ecosystem, humans exacerbates the problems.
Yeah,
and ultimately, although we're all interconnected, but in this case, it looks like we're very much the ones to blame for setting off the cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Jake. So normally in this podcast, we try and make unusual links. And what do you have for, this week's thing? So are you saying that basically you've got a really weird link between cavers, spelunkers, and people putting lots of extra pesticide on? Is that it? Because we've already covered that.
So listeners might presume that the link this week was a fungus that evolved in Europe, P. destructans, and increased pesticide use in North America. And that's a pretty insane, cool link anyway, isn't it? But actually, we're going to go one step further because we saw an increased use in pesticide due to the bat population decline. This was actually linked to an increase in child mortality. Pretty crazy stuff. So let's just read a snippet from the study. The study published in Science on Thursday found that farmers dramatically increased pesticide use after the bat die-offs, which was in turn linked to an average infant mortality increase of nearly 8% in the states that the study took place. And unusually, the research suggests a causative link between human and bat well-being.
Wow. I mean, so what were the children dying of, and how is that linked to pesticides? I mean, I know you've kind of explained it a little bit, but I sort of understand how that link is.
Yeah, the study authors looked at infant mortality, and it's a metric commonly used to judge the impact of environmental toxins, apparently.
Okay.
So environmental toxins are linked to infant mortality. So infected counties had an infant death rate of 8% higher on average than counties with healthy bats, despite pesticide use being within regulatory limits. This equated to 1,334 extra infant deaths. Insane, isn't it? Mind-blowing, really.
Wow. Yeah, actually, my head's just blown here.
Yeah,
it's not blown off. Yeah, well, because what I'm thinking is, what happens if we had no pesticides? I mean, if pesticides are the problem, then we've got an 8%.
This is what I'm surprised that it's not like global uproar that pesticide use is killing off human babies.
I mean, that's just. Are we not in the same situation as where, in the 1950s, people started publishing correlative studies of tobacco usage and mortality from lung diseases and stuff like that? I mean, surely this should be now something that tells us pesticides are in fact killing infants.
As the authors, they tested lots of other factors as well, so that might plausibly explain the rise in deaths. So they looked at unemployment, the opioid epidemic, the weather, differences among mothers, the introduction of genetically modified crops. Yeah, exactly. None of these things explain the increase in pesticide use or the rise in infant deaths.
Whoa.
There are studies before that have shown links between these types of environmental toxins and infant mortality as well.
I mean, at
It's
this
crazy,
point,
isn't it?
I mean, I still haven't figured out what the link is between the actual pesticides. Is it because those pesticides linger on the foods that are being eaten by infants or eaten by the mothers that then produce milk that the infants have? I mean, I still haven't figured out what that bit is, but surely we should now be pumping huge amounts of money into figuring out what that...
Apparently been known since the 1960s. So Columbia history professor David Rosner said he's basically spent his career investigating environmental toxins. He said the study joins a body of evidence going back to the 1960s that pesticides adversely affect human health. We're dumping these synthetic materials into our environments, not knowing anything about them really, what their impacts are going to be. It's not surprising. It's just kind of shocking that we discover it every year.
Bloody hell.
Isn't it insane?
Yeah, because I'm thinking, all right, so we've had catastrophic decrease in bat populations, and you've described how they can be eating up to 3,000 insects a night, and a single individual. So if you have 95%, so you kind of figure out, okay, well, how many insects are they actually eating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe what we could look at is the stats of how much more pesticide was being applied, and then on the base load of whatever the pesticide was that's being used there, and whatever that is, if that increased an 8% increase in infant mortality, then what happens if you took the base load away? Yeah,
exactly. Be an interesting study. But again, it goes back to bats getting bad press for no reason. That actually, if you think about it from one perspective, they're actually preventing infant mortality.
Yeah, I think it's important that the two of us maybe form a political party and believe that you could be called Batman and I would stay as Robin.
I like it. It's a good idea. So just a couple of other points. This new story, it's quite interesting because we've spoken about a couple of other things in this story as well in some of our other episodes. So a number of recent studies have shown how collapsing populations of wildlife can have unexpected knock-on effects for people. In June, Frank is the author of the science paper, and another researcher estimated that the collapse of India's vulture populations may have resulted in 500,000 human deaths because without the scavenging birds to eat rotting meat, rabies and other infections proliferate.
We already had that. We discussed that before.
We've done that one. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right, Jake. I mean, now you've blown my mind. I don't think you're able to blow it anymore.
Did you want to just summarize the link from the very start?
Yeah.
Just in case we haven't repeated ourselves enough.
Yeah. You don't want me to repeat it now, do you? You just did a good job. All right. Okay. So in summary, Jake, this is an extraordinary link. And I think that you're saying we've got a fungus that is prevalent in caves. You've had a little bit of an eye-opener for me that this may have also been something that co-evolved with some plants. Some cavers the suggestion is they brought it over with their equipment because it wasn't washed and sterilized enough, having visited a cave somewhere in Europe. They've come to somewhere in New York State. Some cavers then in 2006. They took some photos of some unusual bats with got white noses. Couple of years later, we're looking at decimations of bat populations with tens of millions of bats dying around. Those bats are, in fact, for the ecosystem, an incredibly important source of keeping the pesticides down. The farmers didn't notice the lack of bats, but they noticed that their yields and their crops, and so they naturally put on more pesticides. Those pesticides, which we're not quite sure of how, but that we seem to have very good evidence that that is in fact the cause of an increase of infant mortality by about 8%.
Correct. Very well summarized. We'll keep your version in.
Yeah, Jake, I think we should give ourselves both a 9 out of 10 for that, mainly because we did kind of
10 out of 10 for repetition, really. Just in case you didn't get it.
That should be Spinal Tap. But I was going to say we should get ourselves a very high score, 9, if not 10, mainly because we kind of anticipated this. Yeah.
We've spoken about similar things in previous podcast episodes.
Yeah.
Well, we're both really interested in interconnectedness, obviously, hence us starting this podcast. But some of the other work we're working on with the UN, for instance, is very systems thinking focused and looking at planetary health and One Health, etc. So,
right. Yeah. So normally this section we would be talking about, news from the invisible world, but I want to try and take a slightly different course from you. And that is just a review or a recap of our first series, the first 10 episodes that we did.
Sure, so not in chronological order, though, because I can't remember.
Not in chronological order, but effectively, what surprised you about our first series? What, in terms of doing it, doesn't matter what it is that we spoke about, but even just the format we delivered it in. What was the thing that most surprised you in the first series?
I think the vulture episode, to be honest, we've just mentioned it a little bit today. If people go back to the vulture episode, I can't remember what number it is now, but just that one blew my mind doing some research. So I've ended up writing a chapter in my new book about it as well, just because how profound it is. The vulture population in India declined by 95% in 20 years. It's probably the fastest decline out of any species,
Right.
kind of megafauna, if you will. 95% decline due to this diclofenac chemical that was given to animals. And then this led to a boom in wild dog populations, which then led to an increase in bites with humans, which then led to an increase in transmission of rabies, which then led to a massive rise in rabies-related deaths and impact the Indian economy as well. That episode kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
How about you? What most surprised you about the last series?
For me, definitely I was blown away after you invited me on to do this podcast, and we're doing the research and I'm thinking, oh my God, that does the knock-on effects, the rippling effects. And I'm not trained in systems thinking. So it's been a really massive awakening to that. I think the one that probably made me think twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times was the one that we did on deserts and just how that they are viable ecosystems, but they're quite fragile. And the fact that we are looking towards deserts as being sort of wastelands and it's our job to try and regreen them and, things like that. And although we took a rather silly example that it was going to affect beer production and tequila production. Yeah. But I think the point is that...
They'll not have a bat link as well.
I think it did because that's the fruit bats as being...
pollinators the agave.
Right. Yes, you're correct. But just that microcrust, which I think you then explained a little bit more about.
The biocrust,
Yeah. I'd never heard of that before. So that is, again, just a stark reminder about how it sounds a bit lame to say it's interconnected. Yes, that's the name of our podcast, but interlinked or intertwined or, that everything does have these enormous ripple effects. And ripple is maybe a good word because a body of water where you have a drop that goes in, the whole body of water feels it in one way or the other because it is so intertwined. And I'd never thought about that in all these topics. So I've been really blown away. The more we've got into it, the more you're starting to think, I'd never thought about how intertwined it was.
Sure. I think there's a common theme across many of the episodes is the human impact on the world and how influencing a particular ecosystem or system somewhere can have these massive, like you say, rippling effects across other ecosystems on a global level as well.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that surprised me when we were doing some of the episodes was, especially when it was a little bit more about things like, nuclear fusion. It's more to do with recognition that we need to, as humanity needs to set up some sort of real meaningful oversight committees that have this interconnected overview. Yes. And that without that, they're going to basically go down a very narrow path where it's all about efficiency or economics or, income generation and not recognizing all the ripple and knock-on effects that that's going to have. Yes, so I can't get over how we've probably had about 3 or 4 of those podcasts spoke a little bit about a social dimension, which again I hadn't thought of. So that was a surprise to me.
Good.
So what are you looking forward to for the second series? What's on the agenda for? What do you think?
It'd be good. Let's just do more of the same. I think we're going to tweak the format very slightly. We might literally launch straight into it after the good news, maybe snippet at the start. We are developing a new podcast called Naked Thinking, and it's all about stripping the preconceptions away from social narratives, norms, intelligence about thinking about social behaviors.
Yeah, to taking away what people expect about a particular issue, such as what intelligence is or isn't, then trying to get down to being a little bit more aware of what the fundamentals are so that we can be a little bit less biased in the way that we label or think about a particular topic.
Yeah, sounds good. Just one quick mention. So we had a paper published this week. It's kind of news from the invisible world. It shows that fungi, when stimulated with sound, they actually grow faster. We stimulated this plant growth promoting fungus called Trichoderma hosianum. And this is really good for plants. It sort of fends off diseases, so other fungal pathogens, and boosts the plant's health, and it actually responds positively to playing music or sound. So we see this as a potential application in the future to help restore soil ecosystems and plant soil systems, etc., by using sound.
And have you found whether Tchaikovsky is better than Brahms?
Well, this is what we're testing next. I think we're going for Metallica versus Bach, though.
Okay. Sounds interesting. Congratulations. That's great.
Thanks.
That's awesome.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this is season 2 of Interconnected, and you've just listened to episode 1, and we're looking forward to presenting the next one to you in a couple of weeks, and hope you tune in then. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Bye.